Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the program. Two NATO allies, Turkey and France, find themselves in a very strange standoff of a highly charged nature. France has passed a law which makes it illegal to deny the Armenian Holocaust, and Turkey, to say the least, is not pleased. In fact, the Prime Minister of that country is fuming. Here to give us a background and some understanding on what the issues are that divide these two NATO allies is Scott Taylor, who is the publisher of Esprit magazine. Scott, welcome back to the broadcast.
Always a pleasure.
Scott, could you give us the Armenian Holocaust story? Because a lot of people don't really get what this contest between confrontation, rather between Turkey and France, is all about.
Well, this is something which I've actually written a book about, which is somewhat controversial because it's going back and looking at some of the history of that region and more or less why we know so little about it. These events in eastern Anatolia that took place back in 1915 and throughout the First World War, at a time when the Tsarist Empire was involved in the conflict, the Ottoman Empire was involved in the conflict, the Armenians took the side of the Tsarist Russians. They rose up in revolt. They were then subsequently moved as a security measure or whatever, and hundreds of thousands died. No one ever disputes that hundreds of thousands of Armenians died during that period. But to try to identify exactly what took place, I mean, and then to label it and say it's a genocide, if you look at this thing, there is all kinds of room for historians to debate the exact details of what took place. So that's something where when you've got the French government comes in and says, no, the Armenians have lobbied for this, and we're going to declare this is the case, and no one can deny it, unpunishable by imprisonment. The Turks are still saying, look, the jury's out on this, and we're prepared to open our archives, as they've said, to have a joint resolution with the Armenian government to come to some sort of unified version of what took place.
Are there people inside Turkey for whom this is not settled history?
There's a lot of people, there's a lot of historians out there. I mean, if you look at this, even the British government, which, given who took over, and occupied parts of the former Ottoman Empire after World War I, while it was still war was still raging on that the Anatolian Peninsula, who would have had the best archives, it was the British, and they came back and said that no, their parliament is yet to recognize that the word genocide applies in this case. Just looking at the logistics of it all, the Ottoman Empire was a teetering empire, and the Armenians were part of it as part of the people that were within its borders, and the Turks were fighting for their survival against the Tsarist Russian invasion on that flank. And when the Armenians rose up in revolt, that's something which they figured, well, we better, for safety's sake, move them to another location, as we did the Japanese in British Columbia during World War II, and other people have done the same on numerous other occasions. The fact is, the Ottomans were not capable at that point, logistically, of moving them safely in any regard. So, that's why they were preyed upon by the Kurds that lived in the region, they were preyed upon by the elements, and of course, the people themselves. So, the Turks have never denied that a tremendous atrocity took place and that the tragedy took place, but they're saying that, given what was going on, a three-way, four-way, battle at the time, and then the records, which of course are not that clear. Tsarist Russia disappeared and became the Soviet Union, and all these areas got gobbled up. The Ottoman Empire disappeared and became modern Turkey, Republic of, which again even changed their alphabet from the former Arabic script to the Latin alphabet. So things that happen. It's very tough to go back, and believe me, I've tried to research this, and without having people that are skilled in the language of Ottoman to recognize the records. And these were handwritten. A lot of this stuff, this was like basic primitive telegraph or some railway lines, but otherwise it was still messages being taken by horseback. It was a pretty remote, primitive area with very, very few independent eyewitnesses. There's a few accounts from different Americans that went through there and have written and said categorically that basically the Armenians gave as good as they got. Atrocities were committed on both sides, and that's where I think the Turks say, look, a lot of people suffered, and percentage-wise, an equal number of Turks and Kurds died in that region, again, from starvation, from the elements, and from the warfare.
When you put these views forward in your book, did you receive blowback from those people who saw you maybe as a Holocaust denier from the Armenian perspective?
I've had death threats, sure.
I guess that's blowback, isn't it? That's the sincerest form of blowback.
What we're trying to say is, look, these are things that we know. The state of the Turkish army, there's a whole book out about how many people died of illness and starvation within the Ottoman army during World War I. Not people that they would have been moving around or whatever, people who rose up against them. They just were simply inadequate. People died throughout the Ottoman Empire when they mobilized for war and had to simply seize either food or transportation, etc., from people in order to outfit the army, and people were left. I mean, it was a pretty tough time on that region. There's no question.
What about the politics that would have compelled President Sarkozy at this particular time to come up with this legislation? Why did he choose now?
Well, I mean, different countries have had different paces and different legislation. Canada's recognized that the word genocide can be applied. The British government hasn't, as I mentioned, but there is a very strong international lobby by the Armenians, and they're very effective.
Have the Americans acknowledged?
Not at the executive level, no. I mean, they're not the presidential level.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's one of those things and again, they know that Turkey's a very strategic key ally within NATO. I mean, and they don't want to jeopardize that. So there's the current situation, there's issues that are happening now being weighed back and forth. And for the French, I mean, they've got a strong Armenian diaspora that have been living there. A lot of them did end up there after they were forced out, or they fled following World War I.
And a pending presidential election.
And, yeah, I mean, it plays well to a local audience. And, of course, it's coming up on the 100th anniversary of this. April 1915 is recognized as the date. So, of course, coming up on the 100th anniversary, there's a lot of lobbying going on to get more and more countries to recognize that this was, in fact, genocide. That being said, what happened, and people do understand that that's what took place. To have politicians in countries like Canada that weren't even established as a nation at the time passing judgment on what happened in an area that we know really very little about. I mean, for our MPs to have passed legislation on this doesn't make any sense. And that's one of the arguments I put forward in the book, that we can't start having politicians around the world determining what took place in history. It makes no sense.
Now, last question has to do with the alliance. France and Turkey, obviously members of NATO. Prime Minister Erdogan, very, very unhappy and strong in his comments. Does this have a spillover effect with respect to NATO operations, especially in the region where Turkey is a key player?
Well, it does. I mean, certainly for NATO, and we've looked at that. I mean, we've got issues going on now with NATO having been involved in Libya, and then NATO's looking at making some sort of stance in Syria, which borders Turkey. And you've also got the Caucasus. Don't forget Azerbaijan. I mean, these are ethnic Turks. They've got their own issue, which is being over Nagorno-Karabakh. I think we've talked about on the show before. Another area we know nothing about, involving the Armenians to the present day, where some 800,000 ethnic Azeris or ethnic Turks have been expulsed and are living in camps as a result of that war, which has been a frozen conflict since 1994.
And you've written about that as well.
It's tying them both in. And then, of course, France was seeing itself as one of the mediators in that conflict, or to try to resolve it. And now Turkey and Azerbaijan have said, look, if you're going to have this pro-Armenian bias, then you have no place at the table. So it's going to have an impact on relations, I mean, not just throughout NATO, but again, in a very volatile situation in the Caucasus, which, again, most Canadians don't know just how strategically important it is in terms of oil.
Yes.
It's got Russia, it's got Iran, it's got Turkey, I mean, and all sorts of other issues, which we remember from Georgia and South Ossetia from 2008. This thing is a tinderbox, like a 10-way tinderbox. So France has now lost its position to sit in judgment there.
Does the UN have a position, a formal position?
On which?
On whether that the Armenian massacre was a Holocaust? Or?
As I know, not as a body, no. But, I mean, a number of countries, I believe Sweden, Swiss, and some have actually made it punishable by imprisonment if very few have taken that stand, as France is now going to.
Listen, great to talk to you. As usual, you throw some light where very few people can.
Hey, my pleasure. Take care.
Take care. That's Scott Taylor, publisher of Esprit magazine, talking to us about this standoff, this very emotional standoff between Turkey and France over the issue of the Armenian Holocaust, which France has now said it is illegal to deny and you can go to jail for doing it, and which Turkey is outraged